All right, it is 3 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. It'll take us a few minutes to go through some of these opening remarks, and then we'll get into the good stuff. So why delay? First of all, thank you for attending. Welcome to our sixth and final session in our series, Talking Confidently About Climate Change in Indiana and Beyond. I am Melissa Widhalm with the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and this series is being co-hosted and brought to you by myself at the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, Jeff Dukes with the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, who's also our speaker today, Austin Pearson and Hans Schmitz, both with Purdue Extension, and Beth Hall, who's with the Indiana State Climate Office. So a few reminders in case you weren't on any of our previous sessions, or if you forgot, our sessions are being recorded, just so you know. Everybody is being entered into the room muted, and you don't currently have the ability to unmute yourself, so just so you know. If you are experiencing any bandwidth issues, one effective way to resolve that is to turn off your camera. So consider that if you start having any challenges there. And also, don't forget, we have a chat box that while we're going through our opening presentation or anytime throughout the webinar, you are certainly welcome to add your thoughts, comments, ideas into the chat for everybody to see and respond to. So today we're going to be doing an interactive session that'll last approximately 90 minutes. From this session, we really want everybody to have some broad understanding of the strategies that we can use to minimize the extent and the severity of climate change. And we also want everybody to be able to identify at least one specific strategy that they can use, whether it's in their community or their area of interest, to start moving forward on actions around climate change, right? Things that we specifically can do to help minimize the extent and severity of climate change. So to achieve these goals, we've broken today up into 3 parts. First, Jeff's going to give us about a half-an-hour overview on the topic. Then we're going to send you to breakout rooms where you'll be able to spend about a half an hour in a small group discussion, and then we'll come back together so we can share what was discussed, what was learned, and any other questions that we have. Now, if you were on session 5 on Tuesday, you had the opportunity to pick your breakout room. If you were not on session 5 or you didn't participate in that poll, please direct your attention right now to the chat box where we will paste in the options for breakout rooms, and you can just simply reply back saying what room you'd like to be assigned to. If you don't assign yourself to a room, we will do it for you. So you will get there one way or another, but this is your opportunity to decide what group you'd like to have this small group discussion with. All right, I think that about does it. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff. We have a lot to cover today, and take it away, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Let me just get my slides fully shared here, and we can get going. Let's see. Okay, looks good. So I'm going to cover a few things that Melissa already mentioned just briefly here. Our goals for today are really that you end up being comfortable talking about climate change solutions within your community, however you define your community, the people that you want to talk with about climate change. So we want to help give you some tools to think about what solutions you might be interested in talking about, what are the different sort of realm of, or what's out there in the realm of different climate change solutions. What are you going to be interested in discussing with the people that you talk with? What are your priority problems to solve, and how might you go about addressing them? And, well, not just how might you go about addressing them hypothetically, but how might you actually strategize a way to get from where you are today to some point in the future where you have implemented that solution. So that's the plan. That's what we're hoping you'll get out of it. And as Melissa mentioned, your community is something that we want you to be able to define. So We hope that you've already chosen one of these breakout groups, but if you haven't, we will at least one more time post in the chat box the different options for those of you who are latecomers. And again, just reply with which community that we have today in the breakout rooms is your preference. So today we're going to discuss solutions. How do we fix some of the problems associated with climate change? The plan is I'll talk about some of the terms and concepts and issues related to climate change for about half an hour. We'll take maybe up to 5 minutes of questions after that. Then we'll send you to the breakout rooms for about half an hour. And then after you're in the breakout rooms, we want to hear what you've said. So you'll report back to the big group for about 20 minutes or so, and we'll wrap it up then. When you're in the breakout groups, there are going to be 3 questions that we want you to address, or 3 sort of sets of questions that we want you to address related to that theme, that topic of your breakout group. So these are questions that you can have in mind as we're going through the presentation today, and maybe you can be getting some ideas as we go. The first one is just in the context of your community or your topic. How is climate change affecting people and important things? What are the impacts that are most concerning to your area of interest? And then second, what are the ways that you can, within that community or area of interest, what are the ways you can minimize the extent of climate change? So how do you essentially minimize your footprint or your group's footprint on climate change through that area of interest? And then also, how do you minimize the severity of climate change? What are things that you can do to minimize the impacts of unavoidable climate change that are coming down the pike, or that are really already here in some cases? So, how do you make sure that climate change has the least impact possible on your sector of interest? And then the third set of questions is really about strategy, about how do you move forward. So who would you need to get involved to help move your solutions and strategies forward? And who are the people you need to engage in discussions, and how might you go about that to really create change? So if we look broadly at some of these questions, there's some basic terminology that you'll see a lot, and many of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with these terms, but I always find them to be a sort of jargon that can get in the way of understanding. The terms are mitigation and adaptation. And in climate change language, people use the term mitigation to basically just say, how do we minimize the amount of climate change that happens? So for instance, that could be, how do we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted every year from a given sector? That's all called mitigation. And then adaptation is basically changing society in ways that will minimize the impacts of climate change. So how do we prepare for the coming changes? How do we build our infrastructure or build our society in a way that the changes that are unavoidable at this point are going to have minimal impacts? So that's mitigation and adaptation. So I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about mitigation options, because adaptation is going to be so different across different sectors, and those of you who are in a health breakout group might have very different ideas for what constitutes useful adaptation than those of you who are in the agriculture and natural resources breakout group. But we'll go through different options. And I want to start off by just saying that mitigation is important because the amount of emissions that we emit globally will make a difference on the future that we see. So here we have a slide that shows projections for the number of days per year that have extremely high temperatures. So 95 degrees Fahrenheit or higher is the high temperature, and in different parts of Indiana. So we have a county selected from the northern part of the state, the central part of the state, and the southern part of the state. And on the 3 graphs that you see here on the left-hand side, there's a number of days historically that have hit 95 degrees or higher in the historical record from 1950 to 2013. And then this looks forward using the climate projections that we have from the Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment, and looks at the 2050s and 2080s and says, well, under a medium emission scenario, which is similar to the trajectory that we're on now, or under a high emission scenario, which would assume using substantially more coal than it looks like we're going to use now, what would the future potentially look like? And so the good news is at this point, the high emission scenario is unlikely, but it does give you a sense of what is possible and what changes are possible under different sort of future emissions. And you see that, by the 2050s, let's say in Marion County, Indiana, so right in the center of the state where we've got a lot of people living, a big chunk of our population, by mid-century, we could go from 4 days that are extremely hot in the past to basically just under a month under the medium emission scenario, or under the higher emission scenario, it would be close to 40 days a year that are that hot. So there is a difference even by mid-century in what we see in terms of extreme temperatures. So mitigation can be important. The actions that we take now can have implications for what we see in terms of our mid-century climate, and there are much more dramatic implications for the late century climate, as you can see, where we have more than 2 months worth of those extremely hot days in the Indianapolis area by the late part of this century under the high emission scenario. The medium emission scenario suggests under 40 days. So again, you've seen a slide like this before. This is just the juxtaposition of temperature and CO2 over the last 140 years or so. Just to emphasize that in fact, CO2 is the big driver of this change, and it's really greenhouse gases that are driving our warming that we'd have to think about in terms of figuring out how to mitigate, how to minimize the amount of change that we see. Where do those come from? Well, this is a somewhat dated figure, but I really like it just for its ability to sort of break out different sectors and show how they generate different gases. So this is an illustration of the whole world's emissions. And it's, I think it's about 15 years old at this point. But the breakdown is not terribly different today than it was then. In terms of something like 3/4 or a bit more of the warming coming from carbon dioxide. Here on the right-hand side, you can see that the bulk of warming that we're getting today is from carbon dioxide, although methane is a big source as well, contributing something at that point, something like 14% of the warming, and nitrous oxide contributing something like 8% of the warming overall, and these halocarbons contributing only about 1% at that time. And then we can trace all these emissions back and see, for instance, what's coming out of agriculture in the purple line here. We can see that agriculture is contributing a lot of nitrous oxide and a lot of methane globally. We can see that globally there's a lot of CO2 being emitted from land use change. That's basically deforestation, cutting down large swaths of forest and turning them into agriculture, whether it's for palm oil plantations, soybean plantations, rangelands, a variety of things. And then we see this, all this energy that's coming from transportation, electricity and heat generation, and industry, mostly generating CO2 emissions. So these things on the left are basically the sectors that we would need to work on to minimize the greenhouse gas emissions that we see on the right-hand side of this. And this is a world chart, but for us, it's maybe a little bit more relevant to look at the US chart. You'll see a big difference when I switch slides here. It should be hopefully obvious that something is going to disappear when I go on to this next slide. I could maybe go back again and go to the US. So this is world again, and here's the US. You can see that those emissions from deforestation basically go away, and we see a lot more CO2 emissions contributing to the changes that we're getting from transportation, from electricity and heat, and industry, and these other sectors here. Agriculture still plays a contributing role, and of course that's a larger role in states like Indiana, where agriculture is a big sector. But again, we've got CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide as some of the main contributors. A small amount of the climate change coming from the US is in halocarbon emissions as well. All right, that's just to give you some context of our emissions that matter here. And I want to give you some global context too of sort of how emissions from different fuel sources are progressing. So here we have the last, what is it, about 17 years, or is that right, of the last 17 years or so of emissions from different fuel sources. So this is energy consumption of coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, and other renewables. And so there are a few main points that I want you to see here. One is that we are globally quite dependent on oil, and that oil use has been increasing. Coal use has been declining recently. Natural gas is growing rapidly, but renewables are growing very quickly over the last 5 years up to 2017. They've been growing at about 14% per year, and that rate of growth has approximately continued. So one thing to understand is that we're on the cusp of energy transformation with this rapid growth in renewables, but renewables have to not just match the growth in global energy use that we have, but they have to also drive down these fossil fuel sources on the left-hand side if they're really going to be replacements that sort of end up slowing and stopping climate change. And so they have to not only grow to be, much larger and replace the sort of amount of energy that's in coal, oil, and gas now, but they also have to catch up with the growth that's going on in those much larger energy sources. So we can think about this overall problem through something called the Kaya identity. Basically, it's just a simple mathematical equation that helps you think about what we need to do to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. And it just says that greenhouse gas emissions are the product of population times per capita consumption, so how much goods and services each person uses, times the energy intensity of the consumption, that's like how much energy goes into each of the goods and services that we use, times the greenhouse gas intensity of energy production. That's like, how much emissions do we have for each unit of energy that we generate? So there are these four knobs that we can turn to slow down greenhouse gas emissions that have to do with population, consumption, efficiency, and our overall energy mix. And then, of course, we can store carbon as well, and I'm not going to get into that too much today, but it's just helpful for me, at least in conceptualizing what our options are in terms of mitigation here. So basically, we've got the option of stabilizing population, which we can do primarily by educating women in developing country, giving them access to economic opportunities, giving them healthcare, giving them birth control. That's something that we can do. We don't have a whole lot of population growth in the US, so it's harder to address maybe at home than it is abroad in a way, but this is one good option. We can reduce overall consumption. That's maybe less fun. In some ways, it's something we've been doing under the coronavirus outbreak for sure. We've been flying less, we've been using less energy on the whole, driving less, and that's showed us sort of the extent to which we can do this, and nobody really likes it that much. Recessions do this too, but we don't really want, we don't want that to continue. Maybe it's possible to reduce excessive consumption in some cases through societal change. Some people, are interested in reducing their personal consumption and look for ways to do that. But in some ways, this outbreak has shown us the limits of what we can do by reducing consumption. We may reduce consumption by, 15% plus in some of the months of this pandemic. We may, over the course of the year, reduce consumption by 5 or 8%, or reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5 or 8% through reducing this consumption, but it's not going to get us the whole way for sure, and it's not something that people love. So our other options are to reduce the energy intensity of consumption. So that's basically to be more efficient. We can do that through energy efficient homes, cars, appliances, etc. And that saves money. So this is typically a politically palatable option, as I'll show you a little bit later. We can buy less energy intensive products. So we can do things like eat local. So there's not as much carbon embodied in the transportation of the food we eat. We can eat less meat because meat, as I'll show you in a little bit, leads to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you were looking carefully, you saw that under agriculture as well with some of the agricultural methane emissions. And then the fourth knob is to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of energy production. And this is one that it doesn't change the quality of life, really. It's still, we're saying you get the same energy, but you get it from sources that don't produce greenhouse gases. So if we had more renewables, more nuclear power generation, these are things that would get us away from that coal, that oil, that natural gas that's leading to climate change. So there may be new technologies that allow us to harvest energy in new ways that can do this. Other things we can do are try to store carbon. So can we preserve the carbon stores that we have, the carbon that's stored in forests and soils today? Can we make sure that doesn't burn up or get somehow transferred to the atmosphere through, I don't know, being tilled repeatedly, the soils being tilled repeatedly, for instance? That's one way we can try to minimize climate change through these other options. Not convert forest to agriculture, try to store more carbon in soils and forest. I showed you briefly a couple sessions ago that renewable energy costs are falling and falling quickly. And today, wind and utility scale solar are the cheapest forms of energy over the lifetime of an energy plant. The only reasons that we're not rapidly changing over in most parts of the world to these sources have to do with, to a small extent, the limits on the amount of energy that is, I shouldn't say intermittent, but maybe variable that we put online. But very few parts of the world are actually reaching those limits. For the most part right now, we're basically not transitioning faster because there are companies that are making more profits off of selling other types of energy, and they don't really want us to use the cheaper energy because they've got a sort of a profit structure and plans in place. And those companies have a lot of money that they're willing to invest in campaigns to exert political influence on maintaining the status quo. Another good piece of news that can push us towards making more use of this type of energy, making more use of renewable energy as it becomes available, and that is also turning the energy efficiency knob, is that batteries are getting cheaper. And so that allows us to electrify transportation. For the most part, things like electric cars, as I mentioned before, are 4 times more efficient or so than cars with combustion engines. And so as we get more efficient and as the power grid gets cleaner, we can more rapidly get away from the emissions that we have now. There's also a role for farms and agriculture to play. I know we have a lot of people on the call who are interested in the agricultural and natural resources breakout group, and so I thought I'd go through a few of these slides that I think are really nicely put together by Inside Climate News that show how farms, typical US farms, are contributing to climate change. So here are the emissions that are leading to climate change are sort of scaled by the amount of their contributions to climate change. So the bigger arrows are contributing more to climate change. All of these emissions are shown in kilotons of CO2 equivalent. So they're basically shown in equivalent units, but if the emissions are in nitrous oxide, they're in purple. If they're in CO2, they're in blue. And if they're in methane, then they're in yellow. And or orange, perhaps. I guess that's orange. So, so you can see here that there's a lot of nitrous oxide coming off of our farmlands. That's causing a major contribution to climate change. That has to do with how you manage the soils. You're going to have more nitrous oxide leaving your soils when you fertilize them with nitrogen fertilizer, and the soils get wet before there are really plants there to take up that nitrogen. So early in the spring, when it rains, after the fertilizer has been put down, you'll get a big pulse of nitrous oxide that comes off into the atmosphere. And that's a lot of what's really represented with that arrow right there. So nutrient management is a technique that we can use to minimize emissions, is shrinking that purple arrow. Livestock emissions are big too. I'll talk about that in a minute too. And those emissions are largely methane. So here we go. Basically, about a quarter of our methane emissions in this country comes straight out of livestock. As it says here, 95% of that is from belching. 5% of that or so comes out the rear end. And then there's also additional methane emissions coming from the effluent ponds. Basically, they're the manure collection ponds at feedlots, where there are just great conditions for methane formation. So this is one part of the agricultural industry that can potentially be addressed in a variety of ways. And then again, excuse me, nitrogen fertilizers lead to a lot of nitrous oxide emissions, as I mentioned before. They're also leading to other problems, such as nitrates getting down into the aquifer, not actually as N2O, but more as NO3. But anyway, that is basically water pollution. You don't want that in your drinking water. And there are a variety of other pathways that aren't good. You don't want nitrogen running off the landscape either and getting into water bodies, because that leads to algal blooms that are problematic for a variety of reasons. So when we think about what we can do to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, there are solutions that we can try to apply excuse me, at a variety of different levels, whether it's international, national, regional, or individual. And you may be thinking of one level or another, and being here today, we'll probably focus more on the individual, state, and city levels, I would think, in the breakout groups. But there are big solutions that we can try to implement on these levels, whether it's decreasing greenhouse gas emissions or increasing solar, wind, and nuclear power. We can think about reforesting. These are all things we can think about, maybe largely at the larger scales where some sort of incentives might come into play for these things. If you could put in incentives in place at the state level, for instance, and many states are doing that. You could put incentives in place at the national level. You can also put, well, those incentives can be sort of positive incentives or negative incentives, where people are taxed for doing things that aren't societally good. There are a lot of potential ways to solve these problems and address all of this. So, excuse me. As a state, some of the solutions that are available to us would be moving our grid towards renewable energy. So far, it seems like the state legislature has basically been slowing that down recently, but we could move our grid towards renewable energy faster. Potentially, we could incentivize that. We could incentivize the electrification of our energy use. So as the grid becomes cleaner, our cars, our buses, our heating are using that cleaner energy instead of burning natural gas or oil. There is news on that front today. I believe it was today or yesterday, it was announced that the state is getting its first electric school bus. So of course that has benefits for all the kids who don't have to breathe in the diesel exhaust, as well as potentially in the long run climate benefits from using a more efficient technology. There are also opportunities in Indiana to store more carbon on land, whether it's in forests or in agricultural soils, which of course we have plenty of. There are ways that you can manage those soils that will more effectively store carbon, whether it's something like reducing your tillage or using cover crops. Just to compare those two briefly, transitioning Indiana to renewable energy would have about 20 to 25 times greater an effect than anything we could do with carbon storage on land. They both matter, but there's a lot more potential in that energy sector really for solutions than there is in the carbon storage part. There's also a lot of potential to reduce emissions from agriculture and to reduce emissions from industry. Those are a little more challenging technologically. The technology may not be quite as ready yet, but we could be working on those things. Individually, there are a lot of different things that we can do, whether it's personal actions in our own personal lives, whether it's political or civic actions, or showing up and speaking at things like public utility commission meetings where decisions are being made, or county planning meetings where decisions might be being made about renewable energy permitting, that sort of thing. There are a lot of different opportunities for us to work. If you're thinking about what your own personal carbon footprint might be, then this is an image that gives you some sense of the impact of different actions that you might have, whether it's hang drying your clothes or replacing a typical car with a hybrid, or using renewable energy at home, or avoiding transatlantic flights. I guess a lot of people are avoiding flights right now, so potentially reducing their impacts that way. But there are a lot of things you can do. Reducing a typical car with electric makes a big difference too. So this is just to give you a sense of that. And eating a plant-based diet, then of course, is reducing your emissions related to methane emissions from the animals that you would otherwise be eating, as well as the production of various things that the animals would eat. So lots of different options here. Different people have different opinions about what's right for them, if anything. Just briefly about the political and civic actions, there is broad consensus among Hoosiers, even that here in Indiana, there are a lot of climate actions that would be good. So in polls, it's been found that 82% of Hoosiers support funding research into renewables. 80% support tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles or solar panels. We don't really have those. 69% support regulating CO2 as a pollutant, which of course we don't do. 60% support strict CO2 limits on coal power plants. We don't do that either. 58% support a carbon tax. So these are just some of the opinions that Hoosiers hold that have not been implemented. And you might ask, well, why, if there's such broad agreement that these things should be implemented, why haven't they been? And it has to do with partisanship, really. Over time, environmentalism has become more and more partisan. And so this is just a map or a figure that shows the voting of senators in terms of being in favor or against environmental regulations. And you see that since basically about the first Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, Democrats have become more and more likely to vote for environmental regulation, and Republicans have been less and less likely. That's been an incredible polarization. And so it becomes increasingly untenable for Republicans, for instance, to vote for anything that's going to be an added environmental regulation, and for Democrats to say no to any sort of an additional environmental regulation. And so that's a challenge, because that means in a Republican-led state like Indiana, it's difficult for Republicans to step out and support something that isn't traditionally associated with their party. So if primary elections are separated by party, then politicians risk losing if they take an unusual position on a strongly divided issue like this. So that makes compromise harder. So what could a solution be? Well, there are a variety of things. One is that some states and other parts of states have what's known as top two primaries, where in the primary you can vote for anyone from either party, and the top two vote getters are the ones that go on to the general election. Another thing that could be done is trying to undo gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a practice of separating voters into districts that create political advantage for one party or another. That typically they make very safe seats for most of the elected officials in a given state, which means that the more partisan they are, the more likely they are to keep their seat over time. And that minimizes the probability of compromise as well. So what can you do personally? There are personal actions that you can take, as I mentioned. There are political or civic actions that you can take to address these issues. And I've got some of them listed here, including just talking about climate change with others and making this a topic that's easier for people to digest and talk about. And then show up and speak at crucial moments is also, I think, a big thing that people can do. I'm taking a little more time than I want here, so I'm going to go quickly through adaptation now. That's everything I had on mitigation. But adaptation, again, is figuring out ways to minimize impacts of unavoidable warming. So what can we do? We can prepare ourselves for the new climate in a variety of different ways, thinking about how to design new structures, whether they're social structures or physical structures that we have in our society, to deal with the new climate in terms of maybe where we place things. Are we building things in flood zones or not as flood zones are changing? Are we building storm drains, for instance, with the appropriate capacity for more extreme rainfall? Are we planning adequately for the precipitation being less predictable, for there being more extreme heat? Are we managing our ecosystems or our agroecosystems for resilience to those new conditions? Are we minimizing the other stressors that might be affecting those systems so that we're maximizing the resilience then of those systems? I just will briefly go through some sorts of options that we have in the different sectors associated with the breakout rooms. Some of the impacts that you might think about how to adapt to in the agricultural and natural resources group are how do you cope with more winter and spring precipitation and more extreme precipitation? These are things that are projected for our state of Indiana. So how do you deal with those? Can you adjust planting date? How do you deal with soil erosion? How do you deal with more extreme summer heat affecting plants or animals or the workers? What do you do about a longer potential growing season? What if there are more pests, insects, and weeds? What if your number of chilling hours are changing and you have an orchard, for instance? You're worried about the trees setting fruit effectively. What do you do if you're worried about harvesting a forest and you don't have soils that are frozen for as long in the winter, so you have a shorter period of time when you can go in and log trees without disturbing the soils? There's a lot more ideas on this front in the 3 of the reports from the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, the ones on agriculture, on forests, and on aquatic ecosystems. We could also look at cities and communities. There we can think about, again, more extreme precipitation and higher average river flows in the winter and spring. How does that lead to flooding? A little more extreme summer heat change the sort of the livability of the environment we're in. Maybe the longer growing season will have effects on gardens. There are a lot of other ideas in the urban green space report from the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. The education group may not think about adaptation normally. You may want to talk about other things, and that's fine. But some impacts you could think about are the more extreme heat could affect student learning, especially in buildings that don't have air conditioning or don't have adequate air conditioning. People don't learn as well when they're too hot. There may be other public health other public health issues that end up affecting students' concentration, particularly if it's more likely that they're going to have families suffering in some way, and particularly in low-income environments. What about health? Well, more extreme heat events could lead to more heat stroke. We may have more tropical mosquito species, which could bring new diseases. We may have expanded tick populations. Again, more potential for flooding. There's more information in the health report, but these are some things that group could be thinking about how to adapt to. And the group on individual action, you might be thinking about how is climate change affecting you and your friends, your loved ones, or your source of income. How's it changing your daily life, or how may it change your daily life? There are a variety of different reports you could look at for this, but the tourism report from the Climate Change Impacts Assessment might be useful for you. So that's it. That's what I've got in terms of a lead-in to these breakout groups. This is our digital business card in case you want to get in touch with any of us individually. We can come back to this, or you can take a picture of it now. But for now, I'll take just a few minutes for questions. I don't want to linger on that too long before we get to the breakout groups.
I'm going to step in with moderator privilege and say we'll take just one question. If anybody has one burning question, we can always come back to questions when we reconvene after our breakout discussions. We just want to make sure we leave you plenty of time, and we're still in great shape with time. But if there's one burning question that you have, now is your chance to stick it into the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview on how our breakout sessions are going to work. But first, I want to say thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful overview. You've given us so much to think about in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation, and thinking about how all of these affect not just our personal lives, but our professional lives, right? We can think about not just how we would take action as citizens, but how do we take action as professionals, right? So all of these different things that we can think about, and that's really what the breakout session is for. So we're going to go ahead and paste those 3 questions here in just a moment back into the chat box so everybody will have those. When you arrive in your breakout room, please assign one person to be your note taker. This person is going to be responsible for reporting back when we get into the main group. That's most likely going to be a report back in the form of a text summary in the group chat. We're probably only going to have a few minutes per group. Maybe we'll get through a handful of groups to do a verbal summary of what they talked about, but we do want everybody to put that summary into the chat so that we have a record of it so you can share what we've done. And also, myself, Jeff, Beth, Austin, Hans, we're all, as co-hosts, going to visit the different breakout rooms. So while you're responsible for self-organizing and you'll be able to work through the questions at your own pace, we will be coming in and out of the room, so we'll be there if you have a question or if you need help getting started or anything else. So in just a couple minutes, we're going to have Hans send us to our room, but before that, I'll check and see if we had any questions come in. Okay, so Marilyn and Greg asked, can you remind us how the moderate and high emission scenarios correspond to global temperature increases? That's a great question.
Just having to unmute myself. So I don't have that perfectly in my head. If any of the rest of you do, then that's great. My best recollection, though, is that the moderate, the medium emission scenario ends up being about a 3.5 degree increase in global, 3.5 degrees centigrade increase in global average temperatures by the end of the century. And I think that the high emission scenario was about 5 or 5.5 degrees centigrade increase by the end of the century. I'm not 100% positive on that right now, but that's my best recollection. And if anybody wants to correct me, then go ahead.
Well, I know for Indiana, I don't know what the global numbers are off the top of my head right at this moment, but I know for Indiana specifically, when we looked at the impacts assessment, it was about 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in the medium scenario, and really between 5 and 10 degrees of warming in the later century, right? So that 5 to 6 degrees, that's sort of middle of the century, medium to high, and then 5 to 10 degrees, that's end of the century, medium to high. So it really depends too on that time period that we're looking at.
And again, you're giving Fahrenheit and I'm giving Celsius, so multiply by 1.8 if you want to go from my numbers to yours. Yeah.
That's great. All right, we're going to get everybody going to their breakout rooms. We'll be bouncing through if you guys have questions. I think Hans already put the questions in the chat box. So how climate change is affecting your community, ways that you could minimize the extent or severity, and who you need to be involved with to move that forward. That's pretty much the gist of it. All right, we'll be automatically bringing everybody back at about 4:15, and we look forward to hearing what you guys talked about.
Okay, we gotta get there.
We hope you had some great discussions and that either as a group or as individuals you were able to really identify some ways that climate change is affecting your community or your area of interest, and what are some things that could be done about it, and who would need to be involved to do that. So if you were the note taker, if you drew that lucky straw in your breakout room, this would be a perfect time to go ahead and open up the chat, pop in your summary, and then now that we're all back together, we'll all be able to see it. If you put your notes in the chat while you were in the breakout room, only people in your breakout room are going to see it. So this would be a time to put it back in the chat, then everybody will see it. Now, we do have about 15 minutes or so for some discussion. We had several breakout rooms, I think 10 or 11 breakout rooms. So if you would like to give a verbal summary of your room, what you can do is raise your hand. Not necessarily like this, there's a button. So if you open up at the bottom of your screen, I think on most of you it'll be the bottom, it says participants. You'll see a participants panel that opens to the right. There should be a button where it says you can raise your hand or give the thumbs up or some kind of indicator. So Hans is looking for that now. If you would like to give a verbal summary of your group, even if it's just reading out what you just put in the chat, we would love to have a couple of groups share. So again, if you click on participants at the bottom, it'll open the right-hand panel. You should be able to see a spot where you can raise your hand. If that's not working, go ahead and just type in the chat, hey, unmute me. So I see Larry, Larry Ron, I noticed had his hand up. Hans, if you, maybe I'm able to unmute him. Let's see.
I did it. There's a little box that showed up.
All right.
And I just pushed unmute. I volunteered because my notes are on paper. I didn't think of the idea of putting them in the chat, but that's just as well because the chat box covers up the pictures of people that are talking.
So if you can go ahead and give us maybe a 2-minute summary or less, and then we'll have time for another group to share.
Okay, so we discovered that we were the education group, although that's a couple of us thought we might be in a different group, but that's because we were in education before on Tuesday and we forgot. And so when we initially talked about it, we thought we could talk about schools, but schools are already very structured with resources, etc. Let's talk about maybe other areas. And so we focused on churches, if nothing else, because churches are a classic community organization that struggle in many different ways with climate, but they also have families, people of all ages, and may represent other organizations. So we talked about what are the kind of impacts. Well, one of the things that happens with churches is there's often old buildings that aren't quite up to spec in terms of technology for efficiency. And so that's a challenge that churches are struggling with. There's an organization called Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light that a number of churches in Marion County, for example, interface with that are challenging churches to figure out ways to be more efficient by modifying the lighting in their churches and structuring their HVACs when there's opportunities, and also providing opportunities for solar grants when they happen to ever show up. So one impact on these organizations is the properties that they use and as a part of their community. Another impact is related to the impact of climate on the activities. So for example, churches have Sunday schools and things like that too. They have educational activities. And if the church is not air conditioned, as things get warmer, that affects that activity. But also, these organizations are typically related to family activities, and there's a health effect of high temperatures too that affects churches. And churches cut across many different sectors of society, and many underserved people in our society belong to churches, and churches is a way that they can maybe have an opportunity to organize to help meet some of the challenges of climate change. And so the idea of how education could be facilitated in these kinds of organizations like churches to help them work together, help provide pastors and groups like youth groups and others with resources to provide education and awareness of what climate change is and how they can learn about things like recycling and learn about things like energy efficiency and that kind of structure. So there are some, we talked about those kinds of impacts, and contacts were like pastors and groups like youth groups, and the kinds of activities youth groups might get involved in, and then also the connections that these organizations might have with other activities. For example, they might be a source of volunteer connections with local forestry projects, or maybe also churches can work together to figure out how to have more church gardens. Churches often have not only buildings, but they often have land. And a number of churches I know in Marion County are working to develop church gardens during the pandemic and actually provide food to food banks from those gardens. So these are all kind of related activities that raise awareness and provide actions. They're usually resource limited, and finding resources and knowing where you can get resources is usually one of the limitations.
Larry, I appreciate you giving us that summary. It sounds like you guys had a lot of great things to talk about in your room. All right, I see Amy Preston has a hand up, so let's go ahead and hear an update from Amy.
Sure. So my group talked pretty much about agriculture and how one of the main ways our communities are being impacted is quantity of water and flooding and also drainage issues. Another challenge in the community, maybe that's related to climate change, is that it's very political and can be difficult to talk about with our target audience. So we talked a lot about different groups and avenues of getting the message out and how to get the message out. Talking with farm bureaus, public schools, farmers that have already sort of bought into the effort. So like a representative from their own group that uses cover crops or something else. Young farmers that maybe have college degrees and are also interested in this topic in the future. And urban farmers who also tend to be more interested in feeding local communities, like I think Larry was just talking about with the churches. So that's mainly what we talked about.
Thank you, Amy. That was really great. And it sounds, again, another room with great discussions. Do we have another group? I think we have a couple more minutes here. And certainly pop your summaries into the chat if you haven't already done that. I'm going to do a quick scroll down the participants. I don't see any hands, but we welcome more groups to share with us what they talked about.
Looks like they're taking time to seriously consider and fill out the poll that's now open.
I know, and I see that we have a lot of information in the chat, and so certainly everyone should save that chat for they can look it over once they're off the webinar. If we don't have any other groups who want to provide a summary, we can also take any additional questions for Jeff or for any of our co-hosts to answer if there were questions that came up. How can I save the chat? Asked Michelle. There should be a button where you see, it says ... next to file. That's what it looks like for me when you're in the chat. And you're typing your message and it's kind of in the corner there. And you click on those three dots and you'll see an option that says save chat and it pops it into a text file. I'm on a Mac. It might look different for you. Jeff, did you have any parting words from the information you provided us with? Any final things we should think about on the solutions front while we're wrapping up here and we're letting people put their final thoughts into the chat?
Oh, gosh. You know, I think yeah, no, that's fine. I think that there are lots of things that we can be doing. I think that there's a big opportunity if we're talking about Indiana and many other states right now. I think there are some big opportunities related to renewable energy, and that the fact that renewables are cheaper than anything else, and yet there's still a small fraction of our, and that we have good wind resources here in Indiana and actually relatively good solar resources compared to places like Europe where they're heavily dependent on them. And we're kind of underusing those resources. That's a big climate lever that our state has. But there are there are a variety of things that are keeping us from using them. And one of those is just that very few people actually realize that renewables are cheaper. And then, of course, they have lots of other health benefits. So I think that that's, one thing that people can actually do that can make a difference in the climate change front is just talking to others and letting them know that there's really no reason for our state not to push towards renewables now and to make a rapid change. And that, just sort of civic education could cause our transition to go a lot faster than it would otherwise. So I guess that's one thing on the mitigation front. On the adaptation front, I think there's a lot of thinking that we need to be doing in this state around some of the issues of flooding and some of the issues with extreme heat that are on the way. But as the people like the extension educators that we have in this state and the NRCS folks are already doing a great job in terms of having some conversations with our agricultural communities around those topics. And so I just hope that continues.
Can you hear me? It's Marilyn.
Yep.
Okay, so we had an education group also, and we talked about how we can help students learn to minimize their own emissions and build lifelong habits. And I apologize because I had a lot of notes that were lost when we transferred back, and Craig has put some more notes in. So what I'm summarizing is what Craig Williams put in the chat. But we really, I thought was really meaningful to talk about collaborating with teachers in other subjects, especially the idea of combining music or art and science. And Craig is a physics teacher, so we had lots of ideas coming out, and we talked about getting buy-in from the school district, from fellow teachers, getting help from experts, such as people from Purdue Climate Change Center or the Soil and Water Conservation Board, and that just recognizing that climate change is global, but if we can make it local, for example, seeing plastic pollution in a local pond, it may make it easier for students to learn. We talked about lots of project learning. That's all.
Thank you very much. I don't know, it sounds like different people might have different pieces of the chat, and so certainly if you were in a breakout room, scroll up to see if that segment of the chat is there. It might be pretty far up because once we all got back together, people start adding in, and then that just adds on. So you might have it and not realize it, or it might be gone. Sometimes it's the mysteries of the internet that I can't explain. Connie, we're going to go ahead and let you share, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So you should be unmuted now, Connie.
Thanks. I just wanted to say one thing, which was the most important part of our talk, was how we need to get people impacted by climate change and the solutions that we're working on. We need to have those people involved in the conversation, and sometimes that's very difficult because people of color and people who are suffering with extreme poverty aren't always available. And so working on these issues, trying to get people's basic needs met, is going to be a very important thing for us to work on if we want everyone to be involved in working on climate change. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Connie, for sharing that. And thank you to everyone for joining us in what is our sixth and final session here in the series. You will be receiving a survey sometime in the next week or so asking if you enjoyed the series, what you'd change about it, if you want to see more of these, less of these, things like that. So we hope that you'll be able to fill that out. Certainly get in touch with any of us, myself, Jeff, Hans, Austin, Beth. We're all here as a resource for you. Purdue University is here as a resource for you. And we really hope that we can partner with you to continue elevating conversations about climate change in our state and elevating action in our state. It looks like we're putting up a shared slide with our contact information potentially. Is that where you were going with that, Jeff? There it is. There's our contact information. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.